Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about the HOA that is trying to evict me. I'll never forget the day I found a neon pink notice slapped across my ornate wooden front door, practically screaming at me from across the yard. In huge, bold letters, it proclaimed that I was being evicted for fraudulent occupation of my own riverside home. At first I laughed, thinking this had to be some bizarre joke or a dreadful mix-up, but then I realized it was no prank. The message was stamped, sealed, and signed by our neighborhood's newly elected Homeowners Association board. According to them, I was posing as the owner, and the actual property owner had apparently directed the HOA to remove me immediately. The problem was, I was, and still am, the one and only true owner of the place. This home had been in my family for years, and I had the documentation to prove it. Yet, here I was, reading an eviction notice that had no basis in reality. I'd like to share how this fiasco unfolded. There's a lot to unpack, from overzealous neighbors to shady tactics from the HOA, to the lengths I had to go to protect what's mine. My property lines border a lazy, winding river that flows past a series of rolling hills. It's an absolutely picturesque location, perfect for canoeing, fishing, or just watching the sunset rippling across the water. My grandparents built the original structure back in the day, and although I've done plenty of renovations, I've always preserved the old charm. The wide porch still has the same antique railings, and the oak trees that shade the yard are the same ones I used to climb when I was 7 years old. Over the years, the area around me developed. New houses sprung up, and the neighborhood decided to form an HOA to preserve property values and maintain communal roads and landscaping. That was all well and good, until recently when they got a new president, Carter. Carter is a person whose entire personality seems to revolve around telling others what to do. He's not necessarily older than me, but he walks around with the attitude of an old sheriff who thinks he owns the entire county. I had seen him around at the monthly association meetings, and each time I noticed his forceful approach to everything from street parking to pet ownership. He rarely listened to reasonable explanations from residents, preferring to pass new regulations by majority vote with little input from the rest of us. In short, Carter is the kind of individual who sees life as a constant struggle of who can get one over on whom. While I kept to myself for the most part, Carter appeared to develop a rather personal vendetta against me when I decided to expand my deck closer to the water. I had the proper permits, both from the city and the county, since the property is close to the river. I made sure everything was properly filed, but apparently, the HOA also thought they had jurisdiction to veto any change, no matter how small. Carter insisted my expanded deck violated the harmonious aesthetics of the neighborhood. I pointed out that my home is older than the association, and I had every legal right to renovate. He bristled at that, but we left it unresolved. I should have suspected something was brewing, especially since he kept complaining that my house didn't fit in with the rest of the newly built dwellings. It all came to a head with that eviction notice. According to the pink paper, I was a tenant, not an owner, and the true owner had told the HOA I should be out in under a week. Now, none of the rest of my neighbors had heard anything about me being a renter. My immediate next-door neighbors, Bryn and Dion, are close friends who come over for dinner at least once a month. They had watched me sign the official paperwork with the county when I inherited the property from my parents. They offered to speak on my behalf if needed, but the letter threatened fines, legal action, and even threatened to have the sheriff's department forcibly remove me. The bizarre twist was that they never offered a name or contact info for this so-called real owner, who was allegedly renting out the property. I tried calling Carter directly, but he wouldn't pick up. Frustrated, I walked a few blocks over to the HOA's administrative office, which was really just a rented room in a small business complex the next town over, to confront him. The door was locked and a sign reading HOA staff in meeting was taped to the outside window, so I tried emailing them a polite but firm request for more details. Crickets. The next day, I received a second letter from the HOA in my mailbox. This one was on official letterhead, repeating the same nonsense about how they had verified from undisclosed sources that I was not the legal homeowner. It demanded I vacate the premises by the following Monday or else face serious consequences. The entire situation was maddening. They were basically telling me in broad daylight that I was squatting in my own family home. A property that had passed through generations was now being rebranded as some random rental. I thought about ignoring it, but the tone of their language suggested they might actually try to do something drastic. like changing the locks or towing my car from the driveway. Sometimes HOAs will call the cops and claim a trespasser is on the property, so I wanted to get everything in writing, including the fact that I am the legal owner. Once I pulled out my file with property deeds, county records, and inheritance documents, I decided I'd need an attorney. A family friend, Rochelle, works at a law firm downtown. She's not a real estate lawyer, but she knows plenty of people who are. She put me in touch with her colleague, Fenton, who's handled real estate disputes before. After hearing my story, Fenton was both amused and outraged. He'd never heard of such a bold attempt by an HOA to evict a legal homeowner without providing any actual evidence. A few days later, while I was waiting for Fenton to get back to me with legal strategies, I got a surprise knock on the door. When I peeked outside, I saw Carter himself standing on my porch, fiddling with a manila folder. He looked visibly irritated, as though the presence of my house offended him. I opened the door and asked him, quite curtly, what he needed. He cleared his throat and went on a spiel about how the HOA had discovered irreconcilable conflicts in the deed records, which made it impossible for me to be the legitimate owner. Apparently, they'd done some kind of investigation. They believed I had purchased the property illegally from a private equity firm that was actually the rightful owner. He just kept talking in circles, refusing to let me get a word in until he finally paused. I told him flat out, "Carter, you're factually wrong, and I have the documentation to prove it. Don't try to intimidate me out of my own place." He snapped back that I needed to be out by Monday because the actual owner was returning from overseas, and they wanted to live in the property themselves. When I asked for the name of this so-called overseas owner, Carter said he was not at liberty to disclose it at this time. That's when I calmly told him that if the HOA attempted to remove me, I'd call the authorities, and I'd also have no problem taking the matter to court. Carter gave me a sour look and left. Over the following week, I started receiving daily letters on HOA letterhead, each more threatening than the last. They began imposing fines for trespassing, which was laughable. They claimed that because I was not the owner, I was also violating random community guidelines. Everything from yard maintenance to improper disposal of trash. It was absurd. My yard is immaculately kept, and I pay for a private waste disposal service, so I don't even use the neighborhood's trash pickup. The allegations reeked of desperation. Meanwhile, Fenton was busy collecting every scrap of evidence: deed history, inheritance records, witness statements, even property tax receipts to show that I've been the one paying taxes for the last decade. I made a vow that once I cleared my name, I wouldn't just let the HOA get off with a finger wag. I wanted to hold them accountable for their reckless behavior. Then an unexpected twist occurred. One late afternoon, I found a letter stuck to my windshield. It wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, and in rushed lettering it read, "Kelton, I'm so sorry. I never thought Carter would try to evict you. He said we'd quietly earn money from extra fees. I'll come forward if you need me." It was signed just with the initial D. I realized it might be one of the HOA board members who was growing uncomfortable with Carter's methods. Still, I didn't know anyone on the board with a first name that started with D, except for Dion, my neighbor. But Dion wasn't on the HOA board. Confused, I decided to keep the letter safe as it might become useful as evidence. Maybe D was an HOA official who was aware of the scheme to extort me or force me out, but I had no clue who it could be. So I set it aside. My frustration level was reaching the boiling point. I was feeling tense and paranoid, worried that one day I'd come home from a grocery run to find my locks changed or the water turned off. My house needed to be protected from these people. So I hired a security company to install cameras around the property. I also changed my locks to higher-grade security ones, just in case. Meanwhile, I was working with Fenton to draft a cease and desist letter, demanding that the HOA stop their harassment. Another issue then arose. The property behind me was sold to a new family. The new neighbor, Harriet, seemed friendly enough. She was middle-aged, had grown kids, and she planned on using her new place as a summer retreat. But Harriet confided in me a few days after moving in that Carter had already tried to recruit her to support the removal of a so-called problem squatter on the street. Harriet had asked which house Carter was talking about, and Carter pointed at mine. Harriet said she was confused because she saw me going in and out of the home all day, and it was obvious that I lived there. Harriet warned Carter that she didn't want to get involved, especially because she was new to the area. but Carter kept pressing her to sign some petition to forcibly remove me. Harriet told me that she refused. This revelation made me even more determined to uncover Carter's angle. Something wasn't adding up. Why was he so dead set on throwing me out? I suspected maybe he wanted to purchase my riverfront property at a bargain price, or he had a buddy who wanted the lot. Real estate around the river is prime. If they could argue that the house was abandoned or had some title issues, they might try to snatch it up cheaply. It's not unheard of for HOAs to attempt shady maneuvers to acquire certain parcels, especially if they see a money-making opportunity. With Fenton's guidance, I filed a lawsuit against the HOA for defamation, harassment, and a bunch of related claims. We listed Carter by name, since he was the acting president and the frontman of this entire fiasco. The lawsuit demanded damages for emotional distress, potential property devaluation, and legal fees. We also included an injunction to stop the HOA from continuing with their eviction nonsense. Let me tell you, once that lawsuit was filed and the papers got served, the neighborhood gossip flew into overdrive. My phone was blowing up from people who hardly ever spoke to me, wanting the inside scoop. Even folks who had never shown interest in me or my property were suddenly wanting to know how I was handling it all. That's how I found out a separate plot line. My next-door neighbor, Dion, caught wind that Carter had been going around claiming that my home was actually owned by a foreign investment firm, some kind of shell company. Carter had apparently told a handful of people that I was a random occupant. Dion confronted Carter at a neighborhood meeting, saying that he's personally witnessed me living there for many years, that he'd seen the original documents, and that Carter's claims were ridiculous. According to Dion, Carter doubled down, insisting he had inside knowledge that I was illegitimate. The entire thing was unbelievably frustrating, but at least I knew I wasn't alone in my fight. For about a week, there was silence from the HOA. No letters, no fines, nothing. Then, one morning, I was awakened by loud knocking. When I answered the door, two strangers in official-looking polos introduced themselves as representatives of the HOA. They said they were there to do a final inspection before my eviction. At that point, I'd had enough. I held up my phone, already recording video, and asked them politely, but firmly, to leave my property. I also informed them that there was an active lawsuit and that they were trespassing. They seemed taken aback and left hurriedly. That same day, I visited the local police station to make an official complaint about attempted trespassing and possible harassment. Though the officer said it sounded like a civil matter, I wanted it documented in case the HOA or Carter tried anything else. A couple of days later, the official response from the HOA's attorney arrived at Fenton's desk. Their letter was a doozy. It claimed that the HOA had a bona fide belief that I was not the true owner, and that they had a fiduciary duty to remove squatters to protect the real owner's property rights. This was absolutely baffling. They offered no real documents to back up their claim, just a mention of certain confidential evidence that they couldn't reveal publicly. Fenton shot back a strongly worded response demanding full disclosure of this alleged evidence, or else we'd proceed with our defamation suit. The standoff was on. Around this time, a second subplot emerged. My cousin Ari, who works as a genealogist, had stumbled onto some interesting historical records about my property while doing a project for a local historical society. It turned out that the land had changed hands only twice in the last century. Once when my grandparents bought it from the original settler family, and then when they passed it down to my parents, and eventually me. Ari had old newspaper clippings, photos, and even a copy of a property survey from the 1920s. This evidence was rock solid in establishing the continuity of ownership within my family. We decided to use this in the lawsuit, because it not only proved my rightful ownership, but also made it clear that the entire property had never been part of any large corporate buyout. Another bizarre revelation came to light when I talked with a local historian who had known my grandfather. He mentioned that my grandparents had, many years ago, turned down an offer from a big developer that wanted to build luxury condos along the river. The historian said that after my grandparents refused, the developer used all sorts of shady tactics to try to force them out. They even filed frivolous lawsuits claiming my grandparents' chain of title was invalid. My grandparents won every single time, but it cost them a lot in legal fees. The historian wondered if Carter or someone on the HOA was connected to that developer. Was there an old grudge or a revived plan to snatch the property? It was speculation, but it provided a motive for why someone would be so adamant about removing me. Just when I thought I'd seen it all, one of the biggest turning points occurred. I got an anonymous tip from an email with no identifying info other than the signature Deep Water. The email stated that Carter was forging letters from a supposed overseas owner to manipulate the HOA board into believing that I was illegally occupying the house. The email had attached images of typed letters that had Carter's name in the metadata. It looked like Carter had created these letters on his home computer, then printed them out and pretended they were from a legitimate overseas landlord. This explained why no one could provide the name of the actual owner. It was a complete fabrication. I quickly forwarded all this to Fenton. He was incredulous that Carter would stoop so low. Armed with this, we filed an immediate motion with the court to compel Carter and the HOA to produce all correspondence about my property. If Carter had indeed forged documents, we were looking at a massive legal and financial liability for him and for the HOA. This was no longer just a matter of harassment, it was fraud. Sure enough, when their attorney saw what we had, they tried to settle out of court. While that was brewing, Carter's meltdown became publicly visible. He started avoiding the usual HOA meetings and refused to answer phone calls from the rest of the board. Rumors spread that Carter tried to pull a similar stunt with a different homeowner, claiming that property had unpaid back dues, but that homeowner threatened to sue as well. This man clearly had a pattern of targeting houses that he believed he could turn for a profit. The board members were in disarray, and some of them started coming forward with inside information. One board member, Dahlia, finally contacted me and admitted she was D, the one who left the note on my windshield. She revealed that Carter had pitched the scheme as a way for the HOA to gain possession of my property, then sell it to a developer under the guise of a community improvement project. Dahlia said Carter had convinced a few members that everything was above board, telling them that he had personal knowledge that my family no longer owned the house. But as the lies piled up, Dahlia got cold feet. When we finally got Carter into a deposition under oath, he scrambled to explain himself. At first, he tried to say that he'd received the alleged ownership documents from an anonymous tip, but Fenton showed the attachments from Deep Water, which indicated that Carter himself was behind these forgeries. Carter tried to deny it, but the digital footprints were impossible to ignore. The entire thing fell apart. Realizing he was cornered, Carter's lawyer asked for a brief recess, and then they tried to float a settlement agreement. In exchange for dropping all charges, Carter and the HOA offered to pay a certain sum, which was quite significant, for damages and to issue a formal public apology. But I wasn't finished yet. I wanted an apology, yes, but I also wanted it known publicly that Carter had attempted fraud. Otherwise, I knew he'd just slink away and possibly do this to someone else down the line. We ended up going to court anyway, primarily because I wanted a judgment on record. In that hearing, the judge was visibly dismayed by what Carter had done. He scolded Carter for disrespecting property rights and for forging official documents. The HOA was held liable for Carter's actions, since he was their president, and they had acted on his direction. The judge ordered them to pay a large sum for my legal fees and additional damages for defamation, among other claims. It was a moral and a financial victory for me. The judge also issued a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from ever challenging my ownership again without a court order. Although Carter avoided any criminal charges in the end, it was clear his reputation was in tatters. Carter tried to spin the whole thing, telling neighbors that he had been misled by an unknown source. But that explanation didn't fly because the evidence of his direct involvement was indisputable. The HOA board called an emergency election and removed Carter from his position. With him gone, there was a thorough shakeup in leadership. The new board president, who seems far more reasonable, reached out to me personally and apologized for the harassment and anguish they had caused. They even offered to waive all future HOA fees for the next 2 years, in a gesture of goodwill, though ironically, I've never used most of their services anyway, as my home predates the formation of the association and is largely exempt from their typical rules. But I appreciated the gesture. With the main conflict seemingly resolved, I was just starting to relax when a new side plot emerged. One weekend, I noticed a battered, rusted boat drifting downstream. It was half submerged, drifting precariously close to my dock, threatening to collide with it. I waded out into the water with a rope, trying to pull the boat away from my property so it wouldn't cause damage. Eventually, my neighbor Dayon joined me, and we managed to secure it to a tree. We checked inside the boat, hoping to find any identifying information, but it was completely stripped. No motor, no registration, nothing. It was like someone had dumped it. A few hours later, who should show up but Carter himself, skulking around in the tall grass near the shoreline. Dayon spotted him from the window and gave me a heads up. I walked outside and confronted Carter, who claimed he was there just to see how I was doing. Neither of us believed that for a second. Dayon and I strongly suspected Carter might have had something to do with that derelict boat. Maybe he was trying one last petty act, hoping it would crash into my dock and cause me trouble. He never admitted anything, of course, but he left quickly when we started asking too many questions. I decided to call the non-emergency line for the local authorities, just to report the abandoned boat. Eventually, it was towed away and we never learned its origin, but in my gut, I'm certain it was Carter's final attempt at sabotage. Despite that hiccup, life returned to normal. I resumed my routine of early morning fishing, working from home, and hosting barbecues with friends on my newly expanded deck. A sense of calm and security washed over me every time I looked out at that sparkling river, remembering how close I came to losing it. If Carter had somehow succeeded in smearing me and forging the property title, my place is my sanctuary, and I have every right to enjoy it without fear. The camera systems I installed are still running, and I keep them well maintained, just in case. But so far, Carter's kept his distance, presumably licking his wounds. Meanwhile, the rest of the HOA has been trying to distance themselves from Carter's fiasco. A few board members who once blindly followed his lead wrote me personal letters of apology. They admitted they had let Carter's pushy nature sway them and didn't do the due diligence they should have. I accepted their apologies, because in all honesty, I just want peace in my own neighborhood. No one wants a feud that lasts for years. There's another interesting postscript. After the dust settled, Harriet, the new neighbor behind me, mentioned in passing that she was part of a local volunteer group that helps maintain the river's ecosystem and cleanliness. She invited me to join, and I leapt at the chance to do something positive for our environment and local community. We went out in canoes, collected trash, planted some vegetation along the riverbanks to prevent erosion, and even organized a small festival celebrating the natural beauty of the waterway. As Harriet and I were cleaning up one day, we stumbled upon an old, half-buried sign that read, "Protected Wetlands." It was dated decades ago. Turns out the area near the mouth of the river had a partial protected status, meaning developments were heavily restricted. If Carter had succeeded in pushing me off the land, there's a good chance any development plan would have run into serious legal trouble anyway, because the wetland sign indicated extra layers of environmental regulation. Regardless, my involvement with Harriet's volunteer group has been a refreshing change of pace. It made me remember why I love living near the water so much. It's not just about property lines and legal deeds. It's about the serenity of nature, the joy of seeing the river's reflections dance on my windows, and the reward of preserving this precious habitat for future generations. Looking back, the entire ordeal was draining, but it taught me an invaluable lesson about standing up for my rights. I learned not to be complacent when someone tries to bulldoze you with false accusations and intimidation. And I realized just how many neighbors quietly supported me, like Dahlia, who risked the ire of Carter to warn me, Bryn and Dayon, who always had my back, and Harriet, who reinforced the idea that neighbors can and should help each other in a crisis. One last development sealed the fate of Carter. The HOA found out that he had also been mismanaging funds for some community landscaping projects. This had nothing to do with me specifically, but the fallout from my lawsuit exposed a lot of questionable bookkeeping on his part. The community voted overwhelmingly to sue him for restitution. I'm told Carter had to pay a hefty sum back to the association for the missing funds. That, along with the settlement he had to pay me, basically wiped out his finances. I heard he sold his house and moved away, although I'm not sure where. At least he's gone. I can't say I wish him well, but I do hope he learned that you can't cheat and lie without facing consequences in the end. Sometimes, as I watch the sun dip below the horizon and the golden light dances across the water, I reflect on how close I came to losing the sanctuary that's been in my family for generations. The stress, the lawsuits, the intimidation letters, all of it weighed heavily on me for months. But it's over now, and my property remains mine, exactly as it should. If there's one bit of wisdom to impart from my experience, it's that you should never underestimate the lengths some people will go to for personal gain. Document everything, know your rights, and don't back down when you know the law is on your side. In the end, justice can prevail as long as you're willing to fight for it. And believe me, when you walk onto your own porch, breathe in that fresh air, and realize no one can take it away from you, it makes every ounce of effort worth it. I sued them for their reckless claim that I was illegally living in a house that's been in my family for ages. I fought back, produced undeniable proof of ownership, and watched as the HOA's ringleader faced legal and financial ruin. My final reward was the knowledge that my family's riverfront home, my safe haven, was securely mine, and I slept better than I had in months. Friends, thank you. See you soon.